Section 2. Iron tracks and steamships infrastructure and its dual legacy. The most visible and enduring legacies of European imperialism in Africa are perhaps the infrastructure projects undertaken during this period. Driven by the need to transport raw materials from the African interior to coastal ports for shipment to Europe, colonial powers embarked on a railway construction boom. Thousands of miles of tracks crisscrossed the continent, connecting mines, plantations, and administrative centers. These railways, while serving as instruments of economic exploitation, also had unintended consequences. They facilitated trade and communication between different parts of Africa, connecting communities that were previously isolated. This increased interaction, while often shaped by colonial priorities, also contributed to the growth of a Pan-African consciousness, laying the groundwork for future independence movements. The development of ports and harbour facilities further transformed Africa's economic landscape. Coastal cities grew rapidly, becoming hubs of commerce and centres of colonial administration. This urbanisation, while fueled by European economic interests, also led to the emergence of new social classes, educational opportunities, and exposure to new ideas and technologies. The development of steamship lines connecting Africa to Europe and other parts of the world further integrated the continent into the global economy, albeit on unequal terms. The legacy of colonial infrastructure is a complex one. While undeniably serving as tools of exploitation, these projects also laid the foundation for modern transportation and communication networks, shaping the patterns of trade, urbanization, and economic development in Africa today. Section 3. Seeds of Change, introducing new crops and farming techniques. Beyond infrastructure, European colonialism brought significant changes to African agriculture. Driven by the desire to maximize profits, colonial administrators introduced new cash crops such as coffee, tea, cocoa, and cotton to many parts of Africa. These crops, often grown on large plantations established on land alienated from African farmers, were destined for export to European markets. This shift towards cash crop production had profound implications for African societies. Traditional subsistence farming practices were disrupted as land and labor were diverted to serve European economic interests. This dependence on cash crops made African economies vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity prices, a legacy that continues to challenge many African nations today. Alongside new crops, European colonizers introduced new farming techniques and technologies. Irrigation systems were expanded, new tools were introduced, and European agricultural experts were brought in to advise on modern farming methods. While some of these innovations had the potential to increase agricultural productivity, they were often implemented without adequate consideration of local ecological conditions or the needs of African farmers. The introduction of new crops and farming techniques, while driven by the pursuit of profit, had lasting impacts on African agriculture. It led to the adoption of new crops, farming practices, and land tenure systems, shaping the landscapes and livelihoods of rural communities across the continent. Section 4. Education and Healthcare, a Mixed Blessing. European colonialism brought about significant changes to education and healthcare systems in Africa. Driven by a combination of paternalistic motives and the need for a trained workforce, colonial powers established schools and hospitals, albeit on a limited scale. These institutions, often modeled after European systems, aimed to impart Western knowledge and values. The introduction of Western education, while providing opportunities for some Africans, also had complex and contested consequences. Colonial education systems often prioritized European history, culture, and languages, neglecting or actively suppressing indigenous knowledge systems. This contributed to a sense of cultural alienation among some Africans, while also creating a small elite class equipped to navigate the colonial system. Similarly, the introduction of Western medicine brought about improvements in public health, with the establishment of hospitals, clinics, and vaccination programs. However, these advancements were often unevenly distributed, favoring urban areas and European populations. Traditional healing practices were often dismissed or suppressed, leading to a loss of valuable indigenous medical knowledge. The legacy of colonial education and healthcare is a mixed one. While introducing new knowledge and technologies, these systems also contributed to the erosion of traditional practices, created social divisions, and often failed to adequately serve the needs of the majority of Africans. Section 1. The spoils of conquest. Economic exploitation and its legacy. The allure of Africa's vast natural resources was a potent motivator for European imperialism. The continent was seen as a treasure trove of raw materials, ripe for the picking, to fuel the insatiable appetite of European industries during the Industrial Revolution. From the gold and diamond mines of South Africa to the rubber plantations of the Congo, European companies, often with the backing of their governments, descended upon Africa, extracting its wealth with ruthless efficiency. This economic exploitation took many forms. Land was confiscated from African farmers and turned over to European settlers or companies for large-scale agriculture or mining operations. Africans were forced into labor on these plantations and mines, often subjected to brutal treatment and appalling working conditions. The profits from this exploitation flowed back to Europe, enriching colonial powers and their citizens, while leaving many Africans trapped in a cycle of poverty and dependence. This systematic transfer of wealth from Africa to Europe had a devastating impact on the continent's economic development. African industries were stifled, unable to compete with the influx of cheap manufactured goods from Europe. Traditional economic structures were disrupted, and many Africans found themselves reliant on the colonial economy, trapped in low-wage jobs with little opportunity for advancement. The legacy of this economic exploitation continues to cast a long shadow on Africa today, as many countries struggle to overcome the challenges of underdevelopment, poverty, and inequality rooted in their colonial past. Section 2. The crushing weight of inequality, social dislocation, and racial discrimination. European imperialism brought with it a deeply entrenched system of racial discrimination and social hierarchy. European powers, fueled by a sense of racial superiority, imposed their own social order on their African colonies, relegating Africans to a position of inferiority. This racial ideology permeated every aspect of colonial life, from the legal system to social interactions. Africans were denied basic rights and freedoms, subjected to segregationist policies, and excluded from positions of power and influence. The education system was designed to instill European values and cultural norms, often denigrating African traditions and languages. This systematic discrimination and humiliation left deep scars on African societies, fueling resentment, resistance, and a yearning for self-determination. The social fabric of African societies was further strained by the forced displacement of populations. Colonial powers, seeking to exploit resources and consolidate their control, often relocated African communities, tearing apart families and disrupting traditional ways of life. This dislocation led to the breakdown of social structures, the loss of cultural heritage, and widespread social unrest. The wounds of the social engineering continue to resonate in many African countries today as communities grapple with the legacy of division and inequality sown during the colonial era. Section 3, A Continent Divided, the Legacy of Political Fragmentation. One of the most enduring legacies of European imperialism in Africa is the fragmentation of the continent into artificial political entities, driven by their own geopolitical rivalries and with little regard for existing ethnic, linguistic, or cultural boundaries. European powers carved up Africa amongst themselves at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. This arbitrary division of the continent had far-reaching consequences, shaping the political landscape of Africa for generations to come. The newly drawn borders often grouped together disparate ethnic groups with long histories of conflict or separated communities with shared cultural and economic ties. This artificial division sowed the seeds of future instability as competition for resources and power along ethnic lines fueled conflict and instability in the post-colonial era. The legacy of this political fragmentation is still felt today, as many African countries struggle with ethnic tensions, border disputes, and weak national identities. The arbitrary borders drawn during the colonial era continue to pose challenges to regional integration, economic development, and political stability. Overcoming these divisions, fostering national unity, and building strong, inclusive institutions remain key challenges for many African nations today. Section 4. Whispers of resistance, seeds of independence sown. Despite the oppressive nature of colonial rule, Africans never passively accepted their subjugation. From the outset, resistance to European imperialism took many forms, from armed uprisings to subtle acts of defiance. African leaders, intellectuals, and communities rose up against their oppressors, fighting for their land, their rights, and their dignity. While these early resistance movements were often brutally suppressed, they kept the flame of freedom burning, inspiring future generations to continue the struggle. The seeds of independence were sown in the hearts and minds of Africans, nurtured by the injustices they endured and the yearning for self-determination that burned within them. These acts of resistance, both large and small, chipped away at the foundations of European imperialism. They exposed the brutality of colonial rule, challenged the legitimacy of European claims to superiority, and inspired a growing Pan-African consciousness. The echoes of this resistance would grow louder over time, culminating in the wave of independence movements that swept across the continent in the mid-20th century. The dawn of independence, while a moment of jubilation and hope for many African nations, also ushered in a new set of challenges. The legacy of European imperialism cast a long shadow over the newly independent states as they grappled with the task of building nations from the fragments left behind by their former colonizers. The arbitrary borders drawn during the colonial era, often dividing ethnic groups and lumping together disparate communities, proved to be a major source of instability. The struggle for power and resources along ethnic lines fueled conflict and instability in many parts of the continent. Civil wars, coups, and border disputes became all too common, hindering development and exacerbating existing social and economic inequalities. The ghosts of colonial divide and rule tactics continued to haunt the post-colonial landscape, as political elites often exploited ethnic tensions to consolidate their power. The challenges of nation-building were further compounded by the lack of experience with democratic governance. Colonial rule had left a legacy of authoritarianism, with power concentrated in the hands of a few. Building democratic institutions, fostering a culture of political participation, and ensuring respect for human rights proved to be daunting tasks. The legacy of colonialism continued to shape the political destinies of African nations as they navigated the complex path from colonial subjects to self-governing citizens. Section 2. The struggle for self-reliance. Economic dependency and development challenges. The economic legacy of European imperialism proved to be one of the most difficult challenges facing newly independent African nations. Decades of colonial exploitation had left many African economies heavily dependent on the export of raw materials to former colonial powers. This dependence on a narrow range of primary commodities made African economies vulnerable to fluctuations in global prices, hindering their ability to achieve sustainable and equitable growth. Efforts to diversify their economies and promote industrialization were often hampered by a lack of capital, skilled labor, and access to technology. The global economic order, shaped by the legacies of colonialism, often favored developed nations, making it difficult for African countries to compete in international markets. The legacy of economic dependence continued to cast a long shadow over the continent, hindering its ability to achieve its full economic potential. Despite these challenges, many African nations have made significant strides in recent decades. Investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure have yielded positive results, leading to improvements in living standards and economic opportunities for many. The growth of regional economic blocs and increased cooperation among African nations have also created new possibilities for growth and development. The journey towards economic self-reliance remains a work in progress, but the determination and resilience of the African people offer hope for a brighter economic future. Section 3. Reclaiming the narrative, cultural revival and the reassertion of identity. The cultural impact of European imperialism was profound and far-reaching. Colonial powers seeking to legitimize their rule often sought to suppress or marginalize African cultures, languages, and traditions. Western education systems prioritized European knowledge and values, while traditional forms of art, music, and storytelling were often dismissed as primitive or backward. However, the spirit of African culture proved to be remarkably resilient. Despite decades of colonial dominance, African traditions survived, often adapting and evolving in the face of new influences. The post-colonial era witnessed a resurgence of interest in African art, music, and literature as Africans sought to reclaim their cultural heritage and assert their own identities. This cultural revival was not simply about nostalgia for the past, it was about reclaiming the narrative of Africa's history and identity. African writers, artists, and musicians used their voices to challenge colonial stereotypes, celebrate their cultural heritage, and explore the complexities of the post-colonial experience. This reassertion of African identity was a powerful force for change, contributing to a growing sense of pride and self-confidence across the continent. Section 1. A continent forged anew. The dual legacy of imperialism. The European scramble for Africa, a period of intense colonization driven by ambition and greed, left an indelible mark on the continent. The echoes of this tumultuous era reverberate through time, shaping the political, economic, and social landscapes of modern African nations. The legacy of European imperialism in Africa is a complex and multifaceted tapestry, woven with threads of both progress and exploitation, opportunity and oppression. On the one hand, European colonialism brought about significant changes to the African continent. The introduction of new technologies, infrastructure, and agricultural practices had a transformative impact on many aspects of African life. The development of railways, ports, and communication networks facilitated trade and connected distant communities. The introduction of Western education and healthcare systems, while often flawed and discriminatory, also brought about improvements in literacy rates and public health. However, these advancements came at a steep price. The exploitation of African resources, labor, and land enriched European powers, while hindering the development of independent and sustainable economies in Africa. The imposition of European political systems, social hierarchies, and cultural values disrupted traditional power structures, eroded cultural identities, and sowed the seeds of future conflict. Section 2. Towards an empowered future, confronting the past, embracing the future. Understanding the complexities of this dual legacy is crucial for comprehending the challenges and opportunities facing African nations today. The scars of colonialism run deep, manifesting in persistent poverty, inequality, political instability, and the ongoing struggle to overcome the legacies of economic dependence and cultural alienation. However, the story of Africa is not solely defined by its colonial past. Across the continent, a new generation of Africans is rising, determined to chart their own destinies and build a future free from the shackles of colonialism. They are reclaiming their narratives, celebrating their cultural heritage, and demanding their rightful place on the global stage. From the bustling cities to the rural heartlands, Africans are embracing innovation, entrepreneurship, and technological advancements to drive economic growth and social progress. The journey towards a truly empowered and prosperous Africa requires a collective effort to confront the injustices of the past, address the root causes of inequality, and foster a spirit of unity, cooperation, and self-reliance. It demands that the international community acknowledge its role in perpetuating colonial structures and work in partnership with African nations to create a more just and equitable global order. The echoes of empire may continue to resonate, but they do not have to define Africa's future. By learning from the past, embracing their strengths and harnessing their potential, African nations can forge a brighter future, one where the continent's rich tapestry of cultures, resources, and human spirit can truly flourish.